The Dodder and the Oak. In a forest tormented by a raging hurricane, a dodder plant sought refuge. On its own, it was weak and could barely move. The howling wind snatched it up violently and cast its miserable body at the base of a mighty oak tree. The dodder looked up at the rain-lashed tree, which was a dark shape in the night. The oak's far-reaching branches waved and cracked miserably wherever the angry wind pushed them. But the oak was resilient. It would neither explode nor break. It laboured to keep itself standing and groaned from torture. Its angry, woeful sounds were but a threat within the forest's miserable choir. If the hurricane continues to strike my thin body, the dodder thought, my strings will be dashed to pieces. It needed refuge, and fast. The fragile plant lifted its weak voice and cried, Mighty oak tree, give me shelter, I beg of you. The oak tree barely noticed it, as it was beset by its own troubles. It held firm against the malicious onslaught of wind that tried to break its back. Mighty oak tree, called the dodder. Please, hear me. Please save me. I am in peril. But the tree was too focused, as were its neighbours, on not being broken in two. The trees all around continued to brace themselves whenever they could against the malevolent storm. The dodder pleaded repeatedly, fearing that at any second it would be picked up and ripped apart. It was a pitiful thing, with a small voice. Mighty oak tree, save me. I fear I will die soon. The oak tree finally heard it. At first, it ignored the dodder, but its cries were strong enough to gnaw at its conscience. The oak had never forgotten its days as a sapling. While small, it had always been frightened of the many ways in which it could die, be it disease, fatal animals, and storms, such as the one that battled it now. How would such a soft and unsupported thing as the dodder fare? The oak tree's heart was softened. It would aid the pleading plant. Hold fast to my roots below, said the oak tree, and you might survive the night. Grateful, the dodder clawed its way to the base of the oak tree and dug its way into the dirt. Its thin strings laboured a great deal to pull it deeper into the soil, but after a time it found the tree's thick, strong roots. The dodder clung to them, wrapping itself around them while the tree continued to fight above the surface. Throughout the night, the oak tree struggled beneath the cloud-covered sky, and every frightening blow that the storm dealt it reverberated down its roots where the dodder lay in fear. Many trees had suffered through the long night. Some had lost their branches, some their heavy crowns, and others had split and fallen. Some had been uprooted entirely by the angry hurricane. Luckily, the oak wasn't one of them. It had endured and would live in majesty another year. When the dodder realized that the noise of the storm had gone, it pierced the surface of soil and looked about in the morning light at the carnage that now draped the forest's floor. It also looked up at the tree who had saved it and marveled that the oak was still alive. The dodder was hungry and used tiny strands that issued from its body to pierce the roots of the oak tree. It had done this without asking, but it had seen that the tree was strong enough to survive the night. What was the trouble then, if the dodder sought to nourish itself with morsels of food from the oak's roots? The roots of other trees watched the dodder feed, but said nothing. It was, after all, a pitiful thing, and would undoubtedly need what food it could find to support itself as it went on its way to some other place. Now that the hurricane had passed, It was indeed time for the Dodder to move on, but it had grown comfortable with lying among the oak's roots, which gave it all the food it needed. It feared going out on its own once more, where it might not receive an act of kindness for a very long time. Days passed. The Dodder grew sickly. It required daylight for strength, and there was none of it underground. Its mood soured from ill health, and worsened as it listened to the echoes of the grass above, which stood at the foot of the tree. The grass always seemed happy and content where they were, because while their roots fed on the soil, their green blades were above the surface, where the sun could reach them, and where the rain could cool them. The Dodder rose above the surface and raised its head. "Mighty oak tree," it said, "I've grown ill underground, where there is no sun. Can I rest at your foot, that I might recover?" The oak tree knew that the effects of the hurricane were still being felt by all, despite the passing of days. The Dodder would indeed need to recover for a day or two more before it was on its way. "Of course," said the tree. "Rest by my foot for a time." The Dodder spoke its gratitude and brought most of its strands up above the surface. Some of the strands, however, remained underground so that it could still feed on some parts of the oak's roots. It sat in an unhappy pile by the foot of the tree, and much of its unhappiness came from the fact that it did not feel as if it was living as good a life as the grass around it. Each blade of grass seemed content and well fed. They laughed and gossiped among each other, but wouldn't share their words with the Dodder. That night, as the grass slept, the Dodder moved quietly. It reached out its hungry fingers for their stems and latched onto them softly. It pierced them and began to feed, thinking then that taking small morsels would hurt no one. But the grass was surprised. They were angry. They protested and cursed the Dodder, who responded by bemoaning its life. "I'm hungry still," it said. "I need sustenance." "How dare you take from us?" said the grass. "You make us weak." "And I'll be weaker still when the time comes for me to depart, because I will be without food for a very long time before I can find it again. I only seek to nourish myself for a short time." The trees above frowned at the Dodder. "Why not grow your own roots?" they advised. "Just like the grass. That way you can feed on your own." "I was cursed to be weak and frail," the Dodder replied. "So frail that I can't grow my own roots and feed from them. If I tried, they would snap. I only need a bit of sustenance, and then I'll be on my way." But the grass continued to grumble and would have rioted against the Dodder had it not been for the oak tree's intervention. "Let the Dodder have its meal," it said. "Then it will be gone." The oak's words were respected. The grass let the Dodder feed. Beneath their labour, the Dodder's strings were fattened over the next few days, and its colour gained vibrance. The Dodder was expected to leave soon, as it had grown healthy enough to make a successful departure, but it was still afraid to move on. It feared having to weather the strength of the rain, the searing heat of the sun, and the vengeful acts of insects. It raised its eyes to the oak tree's trunk and saw how well the mushrooms that lived on it fared. They relied on the tree for sustenance and existed there happily. Was this not the life that the Dodder wanted? A permanent place to make its home, a home that would take care of it. Surely it didn't want or deserve its life on the ground, where it was tormented daily by insects and troublesome animals that bothered its strings. "Mighty oak," called the Dodder, "the grass have grown tired of me. They want me to move on because I have become too heavy. But I am still in need of food for a few days more. Can I rest on your trunk for a time?" "Grow your own trunk," said the surrounding trees. "Grow it as we have grown ours." "I fear I can't," the Dodder replied. "In order to maintain a trunk, I must grow roots, and I have no strings strong enough to do so. I need to feed, but I wish to not be a burden on the grass. May I rest on your trunk, mighty oak tree?" The oak tree pitied the grass, which had been weakened by the Dodder's increasing weight. Since the oak tree was the one who had influenced the grass to tolerate the Dodder, bearing the Dodder's weight for a time was the least the oak tree could do. "Rest on my trunk," the oak responded, "but only for a time." The Dodder thanked the oak tree. It grew longer in order to stretch and lift itself from the grass, but it didn't remove itself entirely, so that it still fed on the grass, albeit lightly, and on the roots of the oak tree below the surface. It wrapped itself around the tree's trunk after securing a firm hold. There it rested. It liked its new position. It was no longer at the bottom where the grass was, and it could see much of the ground beneath it. But it was still hungry, hungrier even than it had been days before, since it had grown much fatter and needed more food to maintain its weight. The Dodder developed a habit of watching its new neighbours, the thriving mushrooms. Their quiet contentment was something it still desired. As days passed, it moved quietly, multiplying and widening its strings. Soon it became a bright yellow-orange belt around the tree's trunk, a thing that could be seen over a great distance. It also boldly sat on top of mushrooms and sent some of its strands onto them, feeding on the nutrients they had. The mushrooms were enraged.
"Why'd you feed on us?" they asked. "When we gave you no permission. You sit on our heads, you feed from our efforts, and you suffocate us entirely, so that some of us can see nothing but a terrible orange haze. Get away from us."
The oak tree heard the mushrooms' complaints and saw that the Dodder was severely embarrassed by them. "You have become troublesome for them," said the oak. "The mushrooms grow weak and will die if you continue to rely so heavily on them for food. Are you not full now and properly nourished?" The Dodder raised its eyes and looked at the blossoms and flowers that adorned the tree's branches. They were well fed and happy in each other's company. They were untouched by strife, it seemed, and had few cares. The Dodder replied,
"I've grown well, mighty oak. My strings are thick and strong, and my reach is much farther than it's ever been. But don't forget that when I leave, I'll have to depend on all that I've eaten for a very long time. I might even perish in the attempt to find another source of food. I'm sorry for the inconvenience I've caused the mushrooms. My growth has overwhelmed them. If you let me climb away to the branches instead, I'll feed there, and once I've eaten enough, I'll be so heavy that I'll have no choice but to fall to the ground and continue my journey." The oak heard the grumblings of the mushrooms, of the grass, and of the trees around it. They all disliked the Dodder and wanted it gone. They believed it was healthy enough to leave and should be made to leave. But the oak took pity on it, as it was a thing without roots and depended on the kindness of others. "Rest on the branches," said the oak tree, "but only for a time. Then you must go." While expressing gratitude, the Dodder unhooked a portion of itself from around the trunk's waist and began its ascent. Never had it been so high. Never had it known what it meant to be held aloft by branches that had never touched the soil below. It settled itself in the crook of a thick branch, relieved. The Dodder, with the passing days, watched the branches and their flowers and blossoms. Such happiness seemed to be their privilege, being up so high. They seemed to have no worries, since they were steadily fed and protected on their perches. The Dodder desired this as well.
It became bolder in its ambition until the day came when the flowers and blossoms woke up one morning and were startled to find themselves enveloped in a sea of orange. They cried out weakly because the food which they consumed had passed from their bodies and into that of the Dodder, who had sent out tiny strings into them that it might feed.
"Oak tree,"
the flowers and blossoms called.
"Enough! We're being fed upon by the Dodder, just as the mushrooms are still being fed upon, and just as the grass are being fed upon to this day. Look, the Dodder's strings are ropes, long and fat, and we are all weary. It will not leave. It will not fall to the ground as it promised. Instead, it gorges itself. Cast it away."
So angry were the flowers and blossoms, and so resentful were the mushrooms and grass below, that the Dodder became fearful. It saw how the other trees around the oak bent toward it with looks of disapproval. It shied away from them, and with as much speed as it could manage, it climbed its way to the oak's crown, begging the tree for protection. As it moved, it left behind thick ribbons of itself on every branch, so that a great portion of the tree was draped in it. While the oak was made to calm the irate plants, the Dodder marvelled at the view that it had been afforded on top of the tree. Save for the disgruntled branches on which it now sat, all of its foes below seemed so small, their complaints against it seemed small as well. Above the oak's crown was the clear, unobstructed blue sky. Birds flew overhead in the open space in ways that the Dodder had never seen before. Thin white wisps of cirrus clouds floated in the distance. Sunlight warmed the bulk of its body as it sat in thought. It didn't want to leave the oak tree. Why should it have to? Everyone else on that tree lived well, despite depending on the oak tree for nourishment. Why should it not also have this arrangement? So rebellious did the Dodder become that it no longer tried to bargain with the plants beneath it. It spent its days drinking up the sunlight. During cloudy days, it would stretch itself out and even out its body on top of the oak's canopy. When it rained, the Dodder hung beneath the branches on which it lay. The oak tree, who had grown quite resentful of the Dodder, politely requested that the Dodder remove its strings from the oak's roots. After all, it was impolite to feed on every part of the tree, which was something none of the other plants did. The Dodder considered the tree's words and removed itself from the oak's roots. As time passed, the mushrooms, blossoms, and flowers continued to complain. They were constantly ill because the Dodder kept feeding on them. The tree heard their words sometimes, other times it was asleep. No longer could it remain awake every day. Many of its leaves had gone yellow from sickness, and its branches were growing dry, stiff, and brittle. The anguished plants shouted at the tree, tormenting it. They demanded that the Dodder be removed. One day the oak, seeking relief, tried to negotiate with the Dodder. "Since you still have yet to leave," it said, "you should remove yourself from my mushrooms and my trunk and recoil to my crown. Otherwise I fear my plants will all rebel." The Dodder considered the oak's words. It didn't want a rebellion. It would feast on the branches on the oak's head only. That way the plants below would forget about it, and it would only be a nuisance to the plants on which it now lay. Its ropes and vines of brilliant orange retreated to the top of the oak's head and sat there in a heavy and burdensome heap, engorged. As the Dodder sunned itself, the tree went back to sleep. The plants that were now free of the Dodder began to recover, but they weren't silent. They grumbled because their father, the tree, was growing ever weaker. Sometimes the oak swayed when a strong wind blew, and it shivered during colder months. Flakes continually fell from its bark, far more than in the past. The grass whispered that the tree's roots ate just the same as it had always done, yet it was always hungry. They feared that it would eventually give up eating altogether because it would be too weary to feed. There came a time when the grass whispered that a hurricane was coming. Other grasses from far away had been speaking of the same. The hurricane would arrive in days, causing as much devastation as it was currently creating in foreign lands. The plants worried that the oak tree would not survive this year. They worried that the oak tree was dying. The plants could not prepare, they could only wait. The Dodder heard the news as well, but it was confident that when the rain and wind came, it would survive by wrapping itself tightly around the tree's branches and swaying with them. The rain was the first to arrive. Soft drops swiftly became heavier. Their small pats urged the Dodder to sink beneath the branches in caution. The sky darkened into a steel grey from angry clouds that had gathered. Thunder rumbled from end to end. The grass below swayed fearfully as they twitched and shivered beneath the cold drops of rain. So did the leaves on every tree. The Dodder held fast to the branches, choking them. A strong wind roared as it descended on the trees, shrubs and grass, heralding the beginning of a long night. Only then did the oak wake. It knew that the horrible disaster had come again. The grass had been urging it to send its roots deeper into the soil, that it might strengthen itself to no avail. It had been too weak to listen. Now time had run out. The noise increased. The rain moved as powerful whips, lashing everything in its path. Weak leaves were violently ripped away, and plants that were unprotected were uprooted with ease. The oak tree swayed miserably in the wind's grip, but the wind had yet to gain a hold strong enough that it might uproot the tree. Left and right, the oak was pulled, but its roots fought to keep it attached to the soil. The battle would be a long one. The hurricane would rage all night. As the oak tree laboured beneath the wind's assault, it grew ever more resentful, not just towards the storm, but towards the Dodder, who fed on it even as it struggled. Even as the Dodder swung and trembled in fear, it continued to be a burden. The oak tree was afraid. Friends on every side wailed in constant torment, and they cried out whenever they looked at the oak. They worried that it wouldn't last the night. "Hold fast, oak," they shouted. "Dig deep. The storm must pass." But the oak swayed. It was tired and needed rest that it couldn't have. Never had it been so weak. Never had it been so depressed. It knew where its strength had gone, and this gave it great shame. Stronger trees called to the oak. "The Dodder must go! Send it away! Why does it still feed while you labour? Why does it eat while you suffer?" Thunder clashed and drummed in anger. The oak tree's hold on the soil was slipping. This had never happened before. "Free yourself!" cried the plants. "Free yourself from the Dodder, or you won't survive!" Lightning struck the oak suddenly. The sting caused it to cry out. The oak tree could take no more. It began to shake, first uncertainly, then vigorously, as the storm worked to drag it from its roots. The oak tree turned its head, this way and that, knocking and ripping the vines and strings of the Dodder. The Dodder wailed and begged to be preserved. It tried to crawl out of reach, but all of the branches whipped and clawed at it. The tree had had enough. The Dodder had to be removed. Again and again the tree twisted and beat its crown, expelling every bit of orange. Ropes and ropes of Dodder fell, hitting several branches on the way down. Mushrooms cheered, as did the flowers, blossoms and grass. Other trees praised the oak while battling the hurricane. Pieces of the Dodder that remained entangled in the tree's twigs were gradually pulled off and left to fall. The oak tree was free. When the sun rose, it found devastation. The weakest branches had been torn from trees and lay broken among stalks that had been callously uprooted. Other branches that had fought until the end swung woefully from their trees' joints. Swaths of grass lay in wet, forlorn carpets all over the ground. But the sky was clear, the soil had been tilled, and all dead weight had been removed. The oak tree woke slowly. For the first time in what seemed to be a very long time, it wasn't as tired as it often was. It found that it was leaning a little to the side from loosened roots, so terribly had it suffered the night before. It surveyed the devastation around it and espied a tiny orange string weeping miserably at its foot.
"Mighty oak tree,"
the Dodder began, but the oak tree caused its roots to rise up out of the ground and lash at the Dodder. "Get away from me," said the oak angrily. "I have nothing to give. Be gone."
"But I'm weak,"
wailed the Dodder.
"I will not survive."
The oak tree struck it again and again and cast it from its foot. "Doomed was I, the day I took pity." The Dodder wept and crawled towards the feet of the other trees, who had seen all that the Dodder had done to the oak tree and the plants that lived on it. They lashed at it with their roots as well, and shook their boughs so that heavy drops of water fell and struck the miserable Dodder. "You will not come near us. You begged the Dodder for shelter, but you were greedy and ungrateful, seeking to destroy the one who showed you kindness. Stay away from us, Dodder. You will find no friends here." Thank you for listening to the story of the Dodder and the Oak. Come back for another story in the Plants series.